Okay, everybody, welcome back. We're into the penultimate session now, and Barry is earning his money this afternoon. Has just finished speaking, and he is now going to be moderating this session. So over to you, Barry.
Thank you, Caroline. Welcome back, and we're in for a triumvirate of Andrews now, all of whom are talking about various aspects of a very important type of local production, the local newspaper press. So I'd like to introduce first, the host has spotlighted your video for everyone. That's jolly good. Dr. Andrew Walker, who was Vice Principal of Rose Burford College of the Theatre and Performance between 2010 and 20. And prior to this, he'd worked for 18 years at the University of Lincoln and its predecessor institutions. He has a long-standing interest in the local press and the articulation of local and regional identified, and he edited a special edition of Journalism Studies in 2006, focusing upon the history of the provincial press. More recently, his work exploring aspects of history of local newspapers, including rough music, community protests, and the local press in 19th century England in the International Journal of Regional and Local History. So Andrew, if I can hand over to you, please. You're muted, Andrew. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I'll try again. Thanks very much, Barry. I'll try and share my screen. Let's just see. So, looking to see where I can. Not quite certain where I can open the. Hang on.
Slideshow top along the bar. If you go up to slideshow,
unfortunately, it doesn't seem to.
It wants to go.
Doesn't seem to be showing on my screen.
Oh.
I wonder if we can share this remotely or centrally.
Try F5, Andrew. Just try pressing F5.
F5.
Yeah.
Right.
You might have to prevent.
Oh, there you go. Thank you very much for that advice. Well done.
We all learn.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. When discussing the physical presence of the English newspaper in the townscape, it's perhaps appropriate to start by referring to Fleet Street, home to a significant number of Britain's national newspapers until the 1980s and 1990s. As the needs of the newspapers altered, as editorial staff grew in size, printing technology changed, and circulations grew rapidly, assisted by the removal of stamp duty in 1855 and the development of a national railway network to aid distribution, so the Fleet Street newspaper offices grew in size and number. Alongside these offices, news agencies sprang up, such as the London News Agency. And amongst the most prominent buildings on Fleet Street in the later 19th century was the relatively newly formed Daily Telegraph. Founded in 1855, the paper moved to its third different and each time increasingly large Fleet Street home in 1928, which is the building you see here on the right. The classical columns and use of Portland stone echo the style of many of the city's financial institutions, seeking to portray a sense of solidity and authority. In some contrast, the building's otherwise Art Deco design sought to demonstrate a modern approach. A prominent element of the design is the highly decorative clock, complete with diamonds, chevrons, and sunburst motifs. Now, if the Daily Telegraph's headquarters was serious Art Deco, then the style of the new Daily Express building, opened in 1932, could be described perhaps as flamboyant. It was an example of the streamlined modern style, inspired by aerodynamic principles. The Daily Express's new Fleet Street headquarters was the first of a stable of 3 similarly designed buildings housing the paper and its sister titles, with the Glasgow building opening in 1936 and the Manchester offices completed in 1939, the one you see here on the right. Just as national newspapers such as the Daily Express tended to have a physical presence in provincial newspaper hubs, so were local newspapers evident on Fleet Street in the later 19th century and early 20th century, as attested by the presence of the Dundee Courier and the Dundee Evening Telegraph at the offices of D.C. Thompson's in Fleet Street, and Mersey House, opened in 1908, home of the Liverpool Post and the Liverpool Echo. Many other local papers boasted of London addresses, often on their editorial pages. In reality, these Fleet Street addresses were often very modest, comprising a floor or sometimes a shared office. The second half of the 19th century was a significant period of growth for the local press, particularly following the repeal of the stamp duty in 1855. According to Mitchell's newspaper directory, the number of local papers titles outside London rose from about 230 in 1847 to just over 1,300 by 1907. And as the local press grew, so the presence of these titles in town centres became increasingly prominent. The Hereford Times, for instance, was established as a 4-page weekly by Charles Anthony in 1832 with local Liberal support. It stood in opposition to the long-established Tory-supporting Hereford Journal. Like the Fleet Street buildings of some of its national counterparts at this time, the architectural style adopted in the offices of the Hereford Times was relatively conservative and classical, evoking banks and the growing numbers of new town halls, with its use of a neo-Italian Renaissance look, reflecting a time in which city-states flourished and local autonomy thrived. Such headquarters, it was hoped by the newspaper's owners and editorial teams, would give the publication gravitas, solidity, a sense of permanence. Kelly's Directory of Herefordshire in 1885 noted that the Hereford Times' office was one of the finest buildings in the city. Now, whilst the paper made much of the fact that its offices were designed by a local architect, James Williams, its sophistication and good taste were highlighted by the fact that the 4 stone statues adorning the ornamental arched turret of the building, which represented the 4 seasons, were of metropolitan provenance, from Messrs. Austin and Seeley of Euston Road, London. The paper noted that these architectural manufacturers' sculptures were seen and admired in the grounds of our nobility and royal gardens. Even in the smallest urban centres, centrally located offices were used by newspaper proprietors in order to ensure the paper's journalists were well placed to gather the freshest news and intelligence. By the second half of the 19th century, many towns had more than one newspaper serving their needs. Often rival titles battled it out in offices situated very close to each other. In the case of the railway town of Swindon, the Advertiser, founded in 1854, was in competition from 1861 onwards with the North Wiltshire Herald, whose headquarters was just round the corner. In the small town of Louth, on the Lincolnshire Wolds, by 1885, 2 newspapers, both with offices in one of the central streets, Eastgate, were competing for readers, the Louth Times and the Louth and North Lincolnshire Advertiser. The Nottingham Daily Express, first published in 1860 and trading in a crowded market with 2 other local Nottingham dailies, sought to ensure itself a notable and conspicuous presence in the centre of Nottingham on a prominent corner site. As with the Hereford Times, the paper decided to engage a local architect to design its headquarters. Watson Fethergill was an adventurous choice. According to the Pevsner Guide for Nottingham, the newspaper's offices are a cacophony of gables, oriels, and a corner tourelle. Now, whilst it's somewhat idiosyncratic mix of styles demonstrates the vitality of the local urban cultural scene. Again, as with the Hereford Times, some form of external affirmation seems to be needed by the commissioners of the building. Here, this is manifested in the heads of National Liberal politicians, John Bright, Richard Cobden, and William Gladstone, when it opened in 1876, and you can just make those out on the right there. Now, arguably, an even more extravagant neo-Gothic design built by the owners of the Western Mercury in the Somerset seaside town of Weston-super-Mare in 1885, using local Bath stone. Again, a local architect was favoured, Hans Fowler Price, who also designed a substantial extension to Weston's town hall. The central place that local newspapers occupied within urban centres' economic, social, cultural and political lives can be seen reflected in the locations of many of their offices. In the case of Sheffield, the Sheffield Daily Telegraph's new offices, opened in 1916, were located in the very commercial heart of the city on the High Street. The English Renaissance style was employed by local architects Gibbs, Floxton and Tether. The tower and dome with its clock, a recurring feature of many newspaper offices, echoed the architectural style of Sheffield Town Hall, built 20 years earlier and situated at the other end of the main shopping street from the newspaper offices. Given the appalling pollution suffered by Sheffield at the time of the building's construction, the glazed faience materials used allowed the building to retain its light colouring, whilst the stone-clad civic structures, including the town hall, quickly darkened as a consequence of the Sheffield smoke. Metaphors relating to the local newspaper's role of shedding light into the darker corners of local politics could perhaps be made here. Local newspaper offices were not only conspicuous and prominent sites within townscapes, but they were also, on occasion, used to sell the local titles and act as shorthand images for the paper itself, as we can see here in the case of the Western Daily Press. At the opening of this building in 1890, the Printers' Register noted that in some of the chief towns, the leading journals have provided for themselves accommodation which is quite palatial when compared with the dingy, incommodious and not very healthy premises in which the preparation and issue of newspapers was formerly carried on. Here we see the Northern Echo building in Darlington, which also occupied a prominent corner position, enabling ready access to the building, not least to aid with incoming deliveries of newsprint and to facilitate vans. The opening of the Northern Echo marked by a grand civic occasion, described as a large and distinguished company, including prominent clergy, local politicians who made speeches about the power of the local press. After the First World War, a number of local newspapers relocated to new facilities. Several of these seemed to take their cue from the adventurous new Fleet Street headquarters of the Daily Express, employing Art Deco architectural styles in town centres, which perhaps revealed a more self-confident approach to the local newspaper's place within the local scene. No longer requiring to demonstrate its permanence and gravitas, having already become established, these papers were able to express themselves architecturally by looking forward, providing a very distinctive physical presence on the high street. So here we see the Loughborough Echo's new headquarters in the early 1930s, and here a little later in that decade, a home of the Bournemouth Daily Echo, again in a very prominent position in the town. A little later, we see a rather dilapidated photo, I'm afraid now, of the Rochdale Observer, again a modernist structure, a little later, built in 1955, officially opened, or at least its foundation stone laid, by the town's most prominent native, Gracie Fields. And the paper's printing presses accommodated here an extension to the building of 1960 were rather unusual in that, unlike many other newspaper offices, they were cast very prominently. And so almost as a theatrical act, you could see the newspapers being produced as they came off the presses twice a week in eye-catching and no doubt ear-splitting style as passers-by past the premises on Drake Street. Now, as it's clear, tended to be geographically mobile entities within the towns and districts they served. Very few long-standing titles have occupied their original premises for the entirety of their lives. In the 1970s and 1980s, a number of major local titles made the move from the town or city centre building, which had often been occupied for many years, to new purpose-built premises in more peripheral urban districts. This, for instance, was the case of the Lincolnshire Echo, moving from its central St Benedict Square location in Lincoln to the city centre's margins on Brayford Pool in 1984, a site it occupied only until 2009, after which it's downsized twice further. Here, this is the Hull Daily Mail, another member of the Northcliffe Empire, which similarly migrated, where it had been situated since 1926, to a more prominent site on the edge of the city centre at Blundell's Corner, where it moved in 1989. This substantial building is still the base of the paper, but its editorial team now share this building with a number of other enterprises. And the printing of the paper, which had taken place in Hull, was moved outside the city. Now, notwithstanding the many rather bland buildings into which some local papers moved in the final third of the 20th century, there were a number that were sufficiently distinctive to become landmark buildings. One of these was the home of the Yorkshire Post in Leeds, an uncompromising brutalist structure designed by John Maiden. The building was officially opened by Prince Charles in 1970. His comments on the building aren't recorded. Printing of the paper was relocated near Sheffield in 2012, and the move of the editorial staff to more modest city centre premises occurred soon afterwards. Demolition of the building took place in 2014. Calls for the tower to be saved were heeded, and so the newspaper's building, the clock at least, and the thermometer survive. Now, this tour around English newspaper offices over time demonstrates both the growth and vitality of the local press, especially from the 1850s to the 1980s. During this time, the architectural styles adopted by local newspaper offices, to an extent, were informed by the bold structures that lined Fleet Street, but also by many of the public buildings, such as the town halls, that were constructed in part as emblems of local authority and power. It was perhaps not surprising that the same classical and neo-Gothic architecture used in the construction of town halls in the Victorian period was also employed in the building of newspaper offices, in which journalists sought to hold to account the occupants of similarly styled municipal and commercial structures. Pride in the locality was articulated through the use of local architects and, where possible, local building materials. Though often metropolitan flourishes were in tastes, towers and clocks abounded, seeking to reflect the authoritative and reliable information provided in the local press to town's readers. These towers and clocks were present even in those newspaper buildings constructed later in the 20th century, when first modernist Art Deco and then more brutalist postmodern styles appeared to be preferred. So when newspaper offices were built in the 1970s and 1980s, these tended to have drifted away from city centres, firstly to the edge of the city centre, and then from about 2000 onwards, still further afield to the suburbs and outlying business parks. And it's perhaps worth noting that there is now a trend for local newspaper offices with skeletal staff and no printing needs to resituate themselves in town centres. Maybe with the collapse of the retail sector, more local titles, if they survive, will be able to return to the heart of towns and cities, though in rather anonymous small offices, rather than in the striking, sometimes palatial headquarters of the later Victorian era. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Andrew, for I found it quite fascinating insight into what is clearly a hitherto under-considered physical aspect of the local press. Thank you very much indeed. We'll take questions at the end.
Thank you, Barry.
So our second Andrew this afternoon is Dr. Andrew Jackson, Head of Research and Knowledge Exchange at Bishop Grosseteste University in Lincoln. A public and community historian, a well-known specialist on the provincial press. Andrew has maintained a pandemic column throughout the first lockdown for the local city's online newspaper, The Lincolnite, and has written related online pieces on the 1918, 19 and 2020 pandemics and local and regional media representation for several publications. So, Dr. Andrew Jackson, over to you. Andrew, are you there? You're muted. Andrew Jackson, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much indeed.
Great.
We can hear you now. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll just try and share my... So I'm just trying to struggle to find it's not connecting with my...
This is the sort of technical logic problem that's overtaken
Yes,
filling
you
your
have in the-
slides as you put them in there, didn't we?
In the middle of your screen, you have an icon share screen. Can you see it?
Take your cursor down to the bottom of the
Yeah,
screen.
I've got share
green one.
screen. And
Yes.
I've got my PowerPoint on my desktop, but it's not picking up the desktop.
Would you like that we share your screen?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, give me a few seconds, please.
Thanks, Joe. Oh.
Okay, I'm sharing your screen now. Can you see it?
At the moment, we just all we've got is the list of speakers on the gig.
Which panel are we? Which number are we?
6-2.
Yes, come on, go.
It's down there.
Check second, ma'am. Like.
That's the one.
Hey, we've got something there now.
That's great. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Hoping you can still hear me okay. And I can proceed. Can you change the slides for me?
Yeah, we can see and hear.
Great. Okay, this is
Okay.
slide 1. If we can just stay on the slide 1, if that's okay. And so this is about a journey I took through the columns of the provincial press from March of last year through to December 2020, and I was paralleling the circumstances of today with those of the 1918-1919 Spanish flu. And I was very interested in what the local media was doing and performing through its content, and how it was reflecting local place and the responses of individual communities through that period. You know, what was were their experiences similar to our experiences that we've been going through? So slide 2, if that's okay. Thank you. So local press content typically distills and combines international, national and local news, one of its functions, and the newspaper column content very much reflected this. And I asked the question a year ago, actually, when we went into the first lockdown, of course, how long do influenza pandemics normally last? And I turned to my primary historical source, my preferred source of choice, the local newspaper, and in particular the local Lincolnshire Echo 100 years ago. And what happened, of course, as perhaps we know, in 1918, a Spanish flu struck across the world, just as in many countries we would as well. Then, of course, there was a global military conflict coming into its final year. And it seemed that the influenza, the pandemic, seemed a long way away. Remarkable rumours in one column of a serious strain of flu reached the Lincolnshire press in March 1918, with speculation that a viral outbreak ravaging among the German forces might hamper their war effort. But when the pandemic did arrive in Britain, it came not in one peak, but actually in 3, as we perhaps know, is similar to our circumstances, of course. So through June to July, the nation came to terms with 2 then unfamiliar facts. One is that an influenza epidemic could break in warmer months, and also that it could strike people more than once within 1 year. By June 1918, the epidemic was getting closer to home in Lincolnshire. And a quote here is that the Grimsby district has been invaded by the influenza germ, ran one report. Dock workers have been attacked while engaged in their duties, and in some cases had to be removed upon stretchers. So there's an interesting mix of news of the pandemic hitting overseas, but also in the UK and also locally. By July in Lincoln, there were calls for the summer term to be ended early. Now that more than half of the children are unable to attend, one newspaper has it, one edition has it. And of course, then the Lincolnshire Echo goes on to report the bigger autumn second wave of 1918, and then also a third wave, later winter going into early spring, a 1919 wave. And we'll know about, you know, waves and lockdowns that accompanied them. On to the next slide, if that's okay. Thank you. Another role, of course, of the local newspaper press and its columns is to mediate, present the state message. And in October 1918, the Lincoln Corporation published its 6 precautions to avoid influenza in the Lincolnshire Echo. And some of these somewhat reflect the character of their times, although others rather have relevance and have been echoed in the official directives and common sense measures that we've been putting into place during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have here overcrowding in unventilated rooms and places of entertainment should be avoided. Aggregation of large numbers of persons in one room, especially for sleeping, is dangerous. Alcoholism or overstrain favour infection, and complicated by pneumonia is especially fatal among immoderate drinkers. dirtiness, whether personal or of living and working rooms, and dusty conditions favour infection. Indiscriminate expectoration is always a source of risk of infection. And the last, and one that's been often laboured, is if every person took all possible precautions, the present danger and mortality from such epidemics would be much reduced. We also have medical officers. We talk about regional directors of health here now, but the medical officers of health of the time, making appeals to the community. Home help was wanted during influenza epidemic in houses where mother is ill, ran one notice. Any woman who has no serious home duties and has knowledge of housekeeping and is willing to help is invited to apply, so a call for volunteers. The local authorities face difficult decisions over what additional sanctions to impose. And of course, we've had, the local lockdowns and different nuanced measures in order to restrict our normal customs and activities outside and within the home. And by the end of October 1918, for example, we've got official edicts falling short of closing all places of entertainment, but certainly banning admittance of those under 14 years of age and requiring full ventilation and disinfecting of buildings to allow a suitable interval to take place between performances. You also have the cancellation of things like electioneering events, public events. And the next slide, please. Thank you. Another function, of course, of the local press columns is to inform and advise readers, and typically carry notices from manufacturers, retailers who want to use column inches to represent their products in different ways. And these tie in with, again, some of the questions that would be familiar to us. How will we be affected by a pandemic? How can we look after ourselves? And one famous manufacturer had to publish a notice to shoppers to stop buying its product. Those customers who have a stock of Bovril should avoid purchasing. They should leave dwindling supplies for those who have a more pressing need of it at this critical time. So this is about rationing, again, we know about. The company added, those who are deprived the bodybuilding powers of Bovril may more easily fall victim to the epidemic. Another notice alerted Lincoln customers to a further shortage of milk here. There is an urgent need for economy during the next 4 months. Young children and invalids have the first claim, the feature declared, for the demands of the latter have been increased by the recent epidemic of influenza. And city residents were informed it is imperative that other persons should give up using milk altogether and reduce their consumption. Today, we've been looking out for news of a cure, and now we have the vaccines, of course, but during the first wave of the flu in the summer of 1918, prospects looked bleak, as they seem to for us. The real antidote is yet to be discovered, and the disease appeared to be extremely virulent and active. A few weeks later, a report could suggest that at least the virus type had been identified. In the meantime, the local health authorities recommended common sense measures, familiar to us perhaps. The wisest course when attacked is simply to go to bed, keep warm, and take light, nourishing food. And at the same time, though, and in less regulated days as we live in, drug manufacturers were quick to claim the healing power of their products. Advertisements quoted from those suffering. I was taken with the flu, shivering fits, pains in legs, hips and shoulders, also rising temperature. Another company stated that it produced the unfailing remedy for the disastrous scourge of influenza now ravaging through the world. And a competitor, by contrast, suggested it had the lightning cure in the form of the world's supreme remedy for many ailments, including influenza. Another function of provincial newspapers was to interest, shock and entertain with personal interest stories. And looking at different provincial press in different areas, actually the East Anglia press was quite interesting in terms of being better on this than in Lincolnshire, with a fuller inclusion of personal stories. The most moving were typically those of the loss of so many soldiers just weeks, even days before the end of the war, some having lasted through years of conflict, or some newly trained and yet even to reach the front. And other accounts referred to civilian settings, and some were equally poignant, particularly those around where the influenza coincided with various social, physical or medical circumstances that drove the afflicted person to suicide, as well as suffering from coming out of the effects of influenza. And then the next slide, if that's okay. Sorry, that's the personal stories one. Sorry, just a few headlines. And then thank you. This is the last, actually. And again, a function of provincial newspaper column content is typically to carry the reports of local organisations, societies, companies with their annual reports or their recent meetings. And if you can go on, if that's okay, one more. Here we are. Yeah, thank you. So this is the last one. So we've got 3 organisations reporting here. The Lincoln Rural Workers Insurance Society, welcoming the fact that there was national centralisation going to happen. Basically, the influenza pandemic really triggered, set us on the long road towards the National Health Service, really, by creating a new Ministry of Health out of a local government board, and the society here, the Insurance Society, welcoming this new Ministry of Health, and saying it would mean the unification of the various departments of government now dabbling in this vital subject, and this would save them from being sent from pillar to post on various occasions. There wasn't a Hancock, there wasn't a Department of Health, the Minister of Health at the time. We then move on to the Lincoln branch of the St John's Ambulance, where this is where you've got local intervention going on here, announcing an important extension of effort through taking its training out to workplaces, offices and other establishments. But the society added, the scheme goes materially further and contemplates such highly important subjects as home nursing and advice on healthy home surroundings and administration. Its new agenda referred to the recent influenza epidemic, and this is quite poignant again, how deeply it has been felt that there was something more one could do for the dear ones lying ill, something very much cutting through to the present. And then finally, the reports of the Lincolnshire Nursing Association, also very much in campaigning mood. It lamented the state of confusion over who should fund health services and the supply of districts. Should it be done locally, nationally by central government, or by voluntary bodies, or some combination of the two? And also, to what extent did we see, or the public saw, public health provision? Was it some form of national general service that everyone should be entitled to? Or is it rather a bottom-up, locally based charitable activity? And they also were welcoming what the new Ministry of Health would bring, but again, appealing here. For now, a nurse in every village was the ambition of the association's new appeal. If only they had been able to get nurses during the influenza epidemic, the mortality would not have been so great. Again, it makes us think, doesn't it, 100 years on. Thank you. I hope that was okay. Thank you very much for the technical help.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Short of a national day of prayer yet, and sending the apprentices out to light and maintain braziers to drive off the miasma, all those examples could have had dates in the last few weeks, couldn't they? It's almost frightening to think. Well, our penultimate Andrew this afternoon is Dr. Andrew Hobbs, who is a former journalist and is now a senior lecturer in the School of Arts and Media at the University of Central Lancashire here in the UK. He's interested in the English provincial print cultures and local and regional identities, particularly newspapers and magazines of the 19th and 20th centuries. His recent publications include the open access book A Fleet Street in Every Town, and he was the winner of the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals, which was the winner of the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals Colby Prize. And he's also contributed a chapter on provincial periodicals in another award-winning book, Routledge's Handbook of 19th Century German Journalism, 19th Century Periodicals and Newspapers. It would help if I could read. Not only that, he's a fellow of the Royal Society. So I'll now hand over to Dr. Andrew Hobbs, and it's all yours, Andrew.
Thank you, Barry. Can you hear me and can you see my title slide?
I can indeed, so we'll assume everybody else can.
Right. So you can see there's a very strict selection criteria for this panel, but I feel eminently qualified having the name Andrew. Right, so this is a case study about how local identity sold newspapers. And by local identity, I mean a loose collection of ideas and feelings and habits. And here's some words and phrases that mean the same thing as far as I'm concerned. Not exactly identical, but they're all sort of overlapping ideas. And local newspapers were one amongst many cultural institutions that were capable of developing local identities and reflecting them. And I think the local press, a lot of its power is it functions a bit like a container, like a box with local emblazoned on the side. And so whatever you put into that box automatically becomes local, or at least locally mediated, such as when an international phenomenon like the Spanish flu hits Lincoln. But fundamentally, this is about business. Local patriotism sold newspapers. But don't take my word for it. Here's a more famous Andrew, famous British journalist called Andrew Marr, who came up through, I think, newspapers in Edinburgh. And there's this widely spread belief in journalism that local newspapers are a printed mirror of a community. And newspapers capitalized on local identities in quite specific ways. They had a set formula, and you can identify this formula anywhere you go, probably around the world, I would say, certainly in the British Isles. And these are just some of the ways in which they packaged local patriotism and sold it back to readers. And this is a case study of one newspaper publisher in particular, Anthony Hewitson, who owned a small weekly paper called the Preston Chronicle in Lancashire in northwest England for 20 or so years. Preston, Lancashire at that time had 4 local papers, weeklies or bi-weeklies, and Hewitson's paper was number 3 out of 4, but it was still a profitable business. And here are the front pages from when he first took it over in 1868 and the year before he sold it in 1889. So yeah, he made a success of it by, and that was a lot to do with him focusing on local identity. He narrowed the geographical focus. His rival papers tried to cover the whole of North Lancashire. He focused just on the town of Preston, which is still quite a big circulation area. And he focused on local news, history. I think local history is a big part of promoting local identity in the local press. And he had a gossipy writing style. For example, he had a weekly series called Our Churches and Chapels, where he'd go around all the places of worship in the town and review them. So he'd talk about the vicar, how overweight he was, the fashion sense of the congregation, the quality of the choirs singing. And people loved to see themselves being insulted or praised in the local press. And it is a technique that's still used today. You put as many names and faces into each issue of a local paper in the hope that each one of those people whose names or faces are there will buy the paper. And this case study looks at how Hewitson became, he went from being successful in the 1870s to being increasingly out of step with his readership, so that his paper was reflecting the place less and less, which made him struggle to survive in a competitive local print market. So as I say, things began to change in the 1880s. And there's just two examples which show how he was beginning to lose his touch as a newspaper publisher. And the first one is the local council wanted to develop the river port of Preston into quite a major harbour. They wanted to upgrade the facilities from this sleepy, romantic-looking marshy wharf into a major river port. And this kind of big local infrastructure project is a great opportunity for local media to capitalize on local identity. And I've highlighted out of my list of techniques that are the formula for capitalizing on local patriotism, some of the things that the local press used when these plans were announced. So the papers printed maps of how the dock development was going to look, views, artists' impressions. It was an opportunity for boosterism. By that I mean kind of marketing a place as a place to invest in, as a place that is good for business. And they used this plan to say, oh, we're doing better than our rival towns that haven't got a river port. Our future is golden. Everything's going to be great. So there's lots of opportunities for local papers to capitalize on that kind of thing. But Hewitson didn't really. This is where he started to go wrong. So one of the papers that was bigger than his was the Preston Herald. They were a conservative paper. It was a conservative local government that was pushing forward this docks development. And this paper, the Preston Herald, was very much in tune with the mood in the town. Most people wanted this thing to happen. So here's this editorial in the Preston Herald on the day when the mayor first put his spade into the ground and turned the first sod of turf when work first began. So a very portentous opening to the editorial column, saying this is a historic day for the town. This paper was very unquestioning. There was lots of corruption and there were conflicts of interest, and it was all badly managed. Lots of money was wasted and went into people's pockets, but you wouldn't know about any of that from the Preston Herald. They were fully in favour of it, unquestioning behind it. And here's an extract from the diary of Anthony Hewitson, our case study publisher. So he didn't attend this great ceremony with a big free lunch afterwards. He just wrote in his diary, sort of miserably, I object to the way the Ribble scheme has been pushed forward. I declined to go. And then in his paper on that day, publicly, he was a bit more ambivalent. He said, well, yeah, this is great, and he was behind the scheme, but he had questions, how much is it going to cost? What are the details? So he was sort of hanging back from it. But he was out of tune with his readers. The town very much wanted it. There was a referendum of ratepayers, local taxpayers. It was 3-1 in favour. There was a council election fought over it. All the council candidates that didn't like the scheme lost their seats, and Hewitson was entirely out of step. The scheme went ahead, although with central government oversight to avoid any more corruption. And in 1885, the foundation stone was laid in a ceremony, which Hewitson did attend, and I think there was a nice free lunch there as well. And there's Hewitson, our man, facing the camera in the light jacket. And there's the Prince of Wales, who later became the King, Bertie, in his shiny top hat and beard. Doesn't look very pleased with Hewitson, actually. perhaps he'd read his gossip columns. So you could say that Hewitson missed the boat. He was left high and dry. He was marooned. The tide was going out on his newspaper. And there's a slightly idealized picture of the new dock and how successful it was, and it was good for the town. Then another example of how Hewitson lost his touch and how he failed to build on local identity as developments happened, as events came along. And this is to do with sport, and in particular football. And sport and football in particular is just perfect for local newspapers. It is and it was. In the 1870s and 1880s in England, sport was becoming more organised. Football was. Someone invented league tables and point systems. The horse racing calendar became more organised, as Steve Tate has written about. And there was this craze. It really was a craze for football, what we call soccer, association football, and it was rippling across from Yorkshire into East Lancashire and then to West Lancashire, where Preston was. And so by the late 1870s, Preston had a number of football teams. The leading one was Preston North End. But there were so many ways in which newspapers could capitalise on this. Football clubs included the name of the town in their title. They used local insignia and symbols. Newspapers could print pictures of the players. It was a way of boosting the town and creating friendly rivalry with other towns. And you could use the language of us and them, of insiders and outsiders. So it was a very satisfactory symbiotic relationship between the local press and football. I did a bit of content analysis of the four main papers in the 1880s. How much sport did they include? And at bottom right, sorry, this is a bit small, but Hewitson's paper, the Preston Chronicle, is the one that's got virtually no sport in it whatsoever. It's got this very flat line at bottom right. Top left is the Preston Herald, the Conservative paper. Conservative papers often aimed at a more working class readership, or a certain type of Conservative paper did. Quite a populist approach. And they really went for football, the first of Preston's papers. And you can see these are all using the same scale. So they kind of started it in the 1880s. By 1890, about 11% of the whole paper was given over to sport, mainly local sport. But a new paper started, an evening paper, and evening newspapers were very much into sport, horse racing and football, really. And so at bottom left, the biggest lump of colour on the graph, the Lancashire Evening Post really just took over and dominated football coverage, so much so that the Preston Herald kind of gave up on it by 1900. But in 1900, the Lancashire Evening Post, the evening paper, it had 30% of its entire content given over to football. So it was massive for the local press, and it was perfect in building on local identities. And this was all crystallised in 1888 and 1890 when Preston North End, the local team, won the double. They won the FA Cup and they won the first season of the Football League, all without losing a game. It's making me proud just to talk about it now. But all of this would have been a huge surprise for the readers of Hewitson's Preston Chronicle, because he virtually ignored it. And when we look at his diary, he was very anti-football. He thought it was all tied up with gambling. He didn't like it. When the crowds gathered outside the newspaper offices in the main street in town, he wished someone would turn a fire hose on them to get rid of them. And on the day when Preston won the FA Cup, or the day they arrived back in town from London, the fans carried them through the streets. They pulled their carriage through the streets. 27,000 people turned out, a quarter of the population. And Hewitson, all he could say, this thing at the bottom, it's very dismissive, very sniffy. The town has a right to feel proud of its football champions, but the town need not go silly. So he's entirely out of step with his readership. He was heading for relegation. He'd scored an own goal. The final whistle was on its way. Sorry about these puns. And so I tried to sort of identify some of the factors in his early success with his newspaper linked to local identity and his later decline. So in the 1870s, he had more local history than the other papers. He had more local news. His direct, personal, chatty, gossipy style really spoke to readers. But it was a different story in the 1880s. The newspaper world was changing fast. I think as the first Andrew talked about with buildings, things were changing. Hewitson never had a purpose-built building, unlike one of his rivals, the Preston Guardian. They were dropping their prices to appeal to working class readers. They were introducing popular features like serial fiction, more pictures and illustrations. Some of them were more in favour of the dot development than he was. They were massively introducing sport, and I've highlighted some of the factors here that were helping his rivals, but whilst Hewitson was ignoring. So to conclude, local identity was important to local newspapers, but it was only one factor amongst many others which made the difference between success or failure for a local newspaper. But it was a big part of their appeal. And they helped to build it and they helped to reflect it. But local identity was dynamic and it was changing. So, for example, new things like an infrastructure development or like football, and unless publishers jumped on the back of those things, then they would lose out. And so for Hewitson, one reason for the decline of his newspaper was his failure to seize on these opportunities to exploit local identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew, for an interesting insight into how to get a local newspaper wrong. Now, we've got a couple of questions and we've just got time for them. So first one to Andrew Walker from, I think it was from Andrew Hobbs. Did envious local rivals mock any of these buildings when they first went up? Andrew Walker, what do you think of that? Andrew? Okay, let's assume he'll come back in a moment. And now a question from Andrew Walker to you, I think, Andrew Hobbs. What did Hewitson make of the 1882 Preston Guild and the opening of the Harris Institute? Didn't he write a local history of proud Preston?
Yes, he did. Yeah, he certainly went big on the Preston Guild. I don't know so much about the Harris Institute. I think he would have done as well. That was like the local mechanics institute that became the university where I'm working now. Yes, he published a book of local history on the back of the Guild. He published a special Guild guide. So these were supplements, extra publications. And from what I remember, all the local papers would have special supplements for the Guild. It was a big civic festival, the Preston Guild. Happened every 20 years. It took us 19 years to recover from the last one. So yes, he would go big on that. But that sort of thing suited Hewitson. He liked history. He liked local sort of civic occasions and tradition, and he liked education. His was a more middle-class paper, but you needed to be broadening your appeal to working class readers in the 1880s. And yes, he took advantage of those sorts of occasions, but he just wasn't able to broaden his appeal to a working class readership. I think that was a problem.
Thank you. Have we got Andrew Walker back yet? No. Well, before I close, just something I thought myself as you were talking through about the importance of local sport in local newspapers. I recall once seeing a kind of small news sheet that used to be produced in a village in Oxfordshire in the 1930s, where an entire column was devoted to the 2 goals scored by its star centre forward, before casually mentioning at the end that the team had lost 13-2. I see Andrew Walker's back. Andrew, I'm sorry. Hello. Oh, I have a question for you from Andrew Hobbs. Quote, did envious local rivals mock any of these buildings when they first went up?
Thanks. I haven't found any evidence of that. Interestingly, what does seem very conspicuous is local rival newspapers completely ignoring the official opening of rival publications. And in fact, in the case of the Nottingham Daily Express, its local rivals took some delight in talking about a fatality that happened on the building site when the Nottingham Daily Express was being constructed. But those newspapers, as far as I could see, didn't report the opening of the building at all.
No. One other question for you. Are any of the printing machines shown in the presentation still present, still preserved?
Most of the buildings that featured are still in existence. The Nottingham Daily Express building, for instance, the Western Mercury office, the Western Daily Press office, they are still present. Some of the buildings are in a very poor state of repair. The Rochdale Observer building, for instance, I'm not quite certain whether that's still in existence. It was for many years derelict. And interestingly, in the case of the later Hull Daily Mail offices on the banks of Brayford Pool in Lincoln, has been appropriated by the University of Lincoln. It's now its business school. It's a bit of a shame that the School of Journalism isn't in there.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we're slightly overrun our time, I'm afraid, but thank you very much indeed to all three speakers for what I think has been an absolutely exceptionally good panel. Caroline, can I hand back to you, please?
Thank you, Barry.
Yeah, you can hand back to me. Thank you very much, everybody. We've just got one more session. We will have a very quick 5-minute break again before we move into our last session. So we'll see you very soon. Thank you.